Hello everybody, it's Mrs. Bennett-Morgenstern at my desk at home. Going to show you how to mix some colors. Hopefully again this won't take too long, but there is once again quite a bit of information. We're going to be using wet painting media in the form of tempera paint. I want to show you a couple of the tools and techniques that we're going to use and the things that you can gather together if you want to try this at home, if you have the paint and the materials. First thing is paintbrushes. Most likely if you're going to use wet media, you're going to use a paintbrush that has hair, not nylon. Doesn't mean that you can't use nylon. Just for the purposes of this video, we're using a hair brush. And you'll notice that there's a handle, the green handle. Then there's a metal part that's called a ferrule that holds the bristles onto the handle. And in this case, this is done with pressure. They squish this on to keep the bristles in place, also with a little bit of glue. There is a number on the side of the paintbrush. Hopefully this isn't worn off. It's probably a little bit hard to see. This is a number 10 paintbrush. And in the case of the numbers, the higher the number, the larger the paintbrush. And paintbrushes come in different shapes. These are called rounds, or they could be called ovals, or they could be called filberts, or they could be called flats. These look pretty round to me. Okay, so we're going to be using hair paintbrush, probably camel. The next thing I have is a palette. These are the palettes from the classroom. This is a palette from wet media, so it can hold it with pretty much not dripping in case you overfill them. A couple of places to mix as we're going to be working along here today. And I also used it to trace the circle for the color wheel onto my paper. All right, and you're going to need some water. And this is the tempera paint. This is the tempera paint from the classroom, kind of getting worn out looking on the label. Tempera paint is one of the older paint mediums, and traditionally it's made with the yolk of an egg mixed with the pigment. So you can imagine that after a couple of days, it probably got pretty stinky if they didn't use it up quick enough. That's why many artists would have, and they still do, they have assistants that would actually make their paint every day under their own special formulations of pigments and vehicles and the way that they like their paints to be mixed, because oftentimes they needed to be done every couple of days because number one, they used a lot, and number two, they'd start to get rancid or they would start to go bad. So I have red, yellow, and blue tempera paint ready to go. I've created a pie chart shaped color wheel using my palette. And in this case, I've separated it with a clear plastic ruler into 12 different sections. For the purposes of the classroom color wheel, don't worry if these are not all the same size. Not really necessary. The point is still made once we start painting. Now, one of the first things I recommend doing if you're going to try this at home is that you label the color wheel. And I had said in the last video that it's important that the color wheel is in the order that it needs to be in order to show the color mixing. So I'm going to write right on here, red, red, orange, orange, yellow, orange, yellow, yellow, green, green, blue, green, blue, blue, violet, violet, and then red, violet. You can put them on the outside. This paper's kind of small, so I put them on the inside. Again, for the purposes of this project, you would never have to worry about the numbers or letters showing through. This is an exercise. It's not, I mean, they do look beautiful when they're done, but it's not, you know, an artwork that we're going to hang up and frame, unless you really want to. So the way that I like to start making a color wheel is to make sure, shake the paint, and if you're using them from a set that you might buy somewhere, you want to like just give them a little stir, because sometimes they separate a little bit. And don't be surprised if the paint is a little stinky. If it's sitting around for a while, it tends to get that way, especially secondary colors if you buy them already mixed. So I'm just using red, yellow, and blue because we're just creating a color wheel. Remember what I said in the earlier video, if you add white or black to them, they become something different. They become values of that color. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just wet my brush a little bit, wipe it off, and I'm just going to fill in with the primary colors. Now, I want you to notice carefully. Many times students complain to me, I'm shaking, I can't do this. Well, one of the ways that you can try not to shake, and I apologize for any of the shadows that you might see, this lighting is really bad in here, is that they hover. They don't rest their arm. They don't relax. You know, everybody wants to try to do a really good job because it's a very technical type of project. I'm just wiping the excess water off on the paper here. Okay, and they, you know, they shake because they're trying not to put their arm down. Rest your arm, rest even your wrist, and use your fingers to paint with. And you don't want to scribble with the paintbrush. Okay, scribbling with the paintbrush does that to the paintbrush. Snarls it. Remember, it's hair. Okay, so you want to keep the paintbrush in good condition, and you want to stroke with the paintbrush. Also, this is kind of small, so I'm not going to use a giant paintbrush to try to paint something this big. Even this one is too big. I'm kind of stretching it with this right now. I can always change paintbrushes once I get to a bigger area, but for now I'm just using the small one. Okay, I'm going to go to, actually, I'm going to go to the blue next. My paintbrush is nice and clean. I've made it hit the bottom of my water container, and I'm making sure that I'm wiping the excess water off as much as possible. You might even want to have a paper towel or a old rag. I kind of use my clothing, but I don't recommend that. Or you can wipe it off on the paper. You can see it's getting kind of absorbent. And once again, dip the paintbrush and go ahead and paint red, yellow, and blue. And you've got your primary sections done. Cleaning off the brush is going to be really important as we go along, starting to mix more colors, because it's if you don't wash your brush off while you're doing this, and your brush has any of the other paint on it that you were using, you're going to start making brown. It's going to get very, very muddy. I'm trying not to dip the paintbrush too much into the tempera because I don't want paint to get up into the ferrule of the paintbrush. When the paint gets caught up inside the ferrule, it dries. And then the next time it gets wet, and then it dries, and then it gets wet, and then it dries. And just with the room that you're in, cooling down, heating up, expanding and contracting like things do in humidity or not in humidity. Eventually, everything loosens up and things start to come apart. I can always fix that. It's not a big deal. The bristles start to fall out. Okay, so making sure that you don't put globs and globs of paint on and keep the brushes clean is really important. Okay, so I've got my primary colors done. And now I'm going to move to the secondary colors. So that would be orange, green, and violet. And this is pretty tricky because this is where if you're not paying attention, you could easily put your colors in the wrong spot. A lot of students tend to say, oh, I'm starting with red and I'm just going to work my way around the color wheel. Well, that's all well and good if you have a lot of practice and experience, but if this is the first time you've been doing it for a long time or the only time you've ever done it that you can remember, I would tend to try to make the secondary colors. That way you already have them made in your palette and then you can use them to make the tertiary colors. Okay, so I'm going to start with orange first. I'm going to take some of my paint out, put it in a little well. And now this is where it gets a little bit tedious. Each time I want to change colors, I have to wash my brush off. Just because of what I said before, that if you don't, you're going to eventually have a lot of muddy color. I'm going to take the tiniest bit of red to start and just start mixing it into the orange that I'm creating. So I mixed it into the yellow that I just put out. Hopefully you can see that. That still looks a little too on the reddish side to me. So I'm just going to clean off my brush and take some more orange. That looks pretty good now. And again, it's a judgment call. If we were in the classroom, I wouldn't be going like crazy on perfection with this. It would not be fair. Like I said, some of you may be very, very out of practice doing this, and for others, it might be the first time, especially with a 12-point color wheel. So I'm going to leave that alone, and I have some orange left over. I'm going to move to green next, and I want to point out something really, really important, and this is going to be true for a lot of color mixing and the using of paint in general. A good practice is to make sure that you always add the darker color to the lighter color. So in this case, yellow is its lightest color in this palette. So I'm taking the yellow out first. And I'm going to add just the tiniest bit of blue to it. It's always easier to make a lighter color darker than it is to make a darker color lighter. So this is still kind of on the yellowish green side. So in this case, like last time, I'm going to add a little bit more blue. Often with tempera, because it's opaque, it dries differently than it looks when it's wet. All right, I'm kind of counting on that because this is a little more yellowy than I would have liked, but we'll see later on. As long as you can see the differences between your colors on the color wheel, you're good. All right, and now to violet. Violet is tricky with this brand of tempera. It looks great when it dries, but it actually looks brown when you're mixing it. Everybody tends to panic, and I'm like, whoa, it's okay. It's going to look brown. I'm actually going to move my palette over a little bit so we can see this better. Now I'm taking some red out, and I'm going to place it in the well. And you want to make enough because you need some left over for the tertiary colors. Okay, and I am going to just add some blue to this. Move that closer to the camera. Okay, again, it's still a little bit on the red-violet side, and yeah, I could go ahead and paint that into the red-violet, but I want to keep this very, very organized. So you can see the point I'm trying to make in terms of finding that middle for your secondary colors. Like I mentioned in the first video, in the color mixing video, I had said that it's not always a 50-50 mix. Sometimes you have to play around with the colors to kind of get them to that in-between secondary color. And that looks pretty good. Again, it looks quite brownish, even though I know it's not. My paintbrush was clean. I have no yellow mixed in, and boy, does that look brown as I'm painting it in. If you were sitting in our big classroom, you would be just absolutely, hey, miss, that's brown from a distance. But up close, you know it's purple or violet. As Homer Simpson says, purple's a fruit. Okay, so now I have my primary and secondary colors. I always thought this looked like a piece of Christmas candy or something, or a piece of candy, old school, or like one of those lollipops that you have the long handle on, the giant ones. But I always get that when I do this so often, and I think the same thing every time. Alrighty, so in my palette, they're not in order. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. I have my primary and secondary colors made. And I don't want to waste these spaces. If we were going to continue on today with the next step, which I will do another time, I would want to make sure that these are kept clean as much as possible. That way I wouldn't have to throw all of this paint out. I could continue using it. But for today, I'm just going to do the primary, secondary, tertiary color mixing. Okay, so I have orange here. It is easier to do the yellow first and do the yellow-orange first. And again, you don't have to worry about trying to make that perfect tertiary yellow-orange. And paint that in. As long as after it dries, it looks different from the orange and isn't too yellow, that would tell me as the teacher that I know you know what you're doing. You just have to practice perfecting it. Many students find these exercises that I'm showing you how to do very relaxing. At the end of the year, I often asked, what was useful or what did you enjoy doing the most? Many students say color mixing, just like this, not even in a painting, just sitting here and figuring out all the colors. I'm going to add more red to this orange, and it won't look like it till it dries. And I could go to a smaller brush if I really wanted to be technical. and try to do it as neatly as possible. Again, not necessary while you're doing this at home. There might be things going on, the dog, other kids, people, music, TV, distractions. Again, as long as we see the changes in the color, you're good. So I'm really washing off my brush. It is really, really important that we don't get any of that orange into the next group of color, because what will it make? Brown. Red, yellow, and blue makes brown. Okay, so here's my green from before. Nice clean brush. I'm going to lighten this up. Technically not lighting it up. I am changing the color. And creating a yellow-orange. Now I know that this is definitely lighter than the green I made earlier. And I had said earlier that I could have probably made that a little bit differently, had a little bit more blue in it. But again, as long as we can see the changes, that this is definitely getting more towards the yellow side, it's fine. And now for the blue-green. And by the way, this is my favorite color. All right. Really wash the brush off again, because we're going to be going into the blue-violet and the red-violet. And remember, red is going to be involved. So when we mix red, yellow, and blue, which is going to be in all of these previous colors in my paintbrush, so I'm washing it really well. We don't want the three colors to mix together. So here's my violet. Now this is probably where you're going to use the most paint, because violet in and of itself is a pretty dark color. And in order to be able to see the differences, I'm really adding a lot of red back into it. And then painting that section in. This is the biggest section in the color wheel. I probably could have used a bigger brush, but I'm pretty quick with this. Notice I'm not scribbling with the brush. I am making sure that I am stroking. I'm not squishing this around. You don't want to snarl up the brush. You know, everything has its place. Different techniques have their place, but when you're trying to do something that has a hard edge, you want to keep the bristles of the brush as tight and close together as you can, and one of the ways you can do that is by stroking, not by scribbling. Okay, I'm going to take the blue out. And mix that in. I might need a little bit more to make a blue-violet. Blue-violet is also a very beautiful color with tempera paint. I tend to, when I'm doing the other painting projects in class, I tend to lean toward the blues, blue-greens, blue-violets, because they're just so beautiful with tempera paint. Now with the lighting that I have in here, still not blue-violet enough. I'm sorry if this is taking too long. I apologize. Okay. Yeah. Definitely different. Trying to keep my hand out of the way because of the glare and the shadow on this. And again, I apologize. If you're doing this at home or you would like to try this at home, I can always test out the colors over here too. I can always make like a little chart up here of all the different colors and make sure that they look different before I actually paint them in the color wheel. So, although it's not dry yet, okay, there is a 12-point color wheel in the correct order. You can see the changes happening, right? It might be a little difficult to see the difference between these two with the lighting in here, but looks pretty good from my angle without the glare. And this lovely bunch of paint that I have left over, as you would in class, once I stop the video, I'm going to take a piece of aluminum foil and I'm going to seal this up along the edges, and that should keep it moist and usable for another couple of days. And when I make the next video, I'm going to reuse some of these colors so I don't waste them. All right, take care.